Hi, I'm Neesa Moodley, business editor at Daily Maverick. And in this Money Sense webinar, buying a house is still the best investment. So of Uber mortgage originator and Warren Ingram, certified financial planner and at Galileo Capital and personal finance author. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so is buying a house the right investment? I'm thinking rich dad, poor dad, and in the current environment, I think it's a question that's really relevant. 40 years ago, I would say in the previous generation, the aspiration was that if you bought a property, you had a home, that was kind of the pinnacle. But in today's environment where people are much more mobile and with remote working, is tying yourself down to a house, a property investment, still the right thing for your wealth? So we're going to be looking at the different pros and cons. Warren is going to talk us through the financial aspects and comparing it to investing rather than putting it into a property. And Rhys is going to talk us through the property market. I think we should start there. Rhys.
The property market.
Yes.
Thanks, Neesa. Yeah, it's it's been an interesting journey over the last few years. Obviously, we came out of COVID with interest rates at very low rates at sort of 7%. We saw sort of a very aggressive uptick up to sort of 11.75%, and we've been there for a little while, and then just more recently over the last sort of 12 months have dropped back down again to sort of the 10.5% level. And the markets moved quite differently over that period. Obviously, at the 7% interest rates, we saw massive influx of buyers. It became the demand was very high. A lot of people who were renting their properties moved into to buy a property, just given the affordability of property at those levels. And we saw a very strong market and prices increasing very nicely, different in different provinces, and I can touch on that, but generally moving well. And then we saw, over 18 months, a significant increase in interest rates for many people who'd bought at that sort of 7% level, now paying 11.75. They saw their home loan repayments rising by sort of upwards of 40%. And that created many challenges for them, but also obviously in the market reduced demand significantly. So, if I just look at our home loan application volumes now relative to, say, 2020, 2021, they, despite them being up a bit on last year, they're still down 25 to 30% on the sort of COVID time when interest rates were 7%. So the market at the moment, slightly improved from where it was a year ago, but still, demand is not great, even despite the 125 basis points rate reductions we've had over the last 12 months. But it's definitely in pockets and geographically quite different. So the Western Cape and City of Cape Town, say, very, very different to some other areas in KZN and or Joburg. And demand and supply are quite different in different places. So I can go into more detail on that if you'd like.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think the interest rate cuts I think the consensus is largely that we're at the bottom of the interest rate cycle. So one of the questions is, I think people may be tempted to jump into the property market now where their affordability is a little bit better. Warren, would you like to address the importance of having a buffer when you're looking at that affordability, particularly now in light of the fact that interest rates are low and very likely to increase over the next 5 years?
I hope you're wrong that they increase, Neesa. It's such an interesting time because we're also at a moment, a point in time where the Reserve Bank is trying to enforce or nudge us as a country to a lower inflation target. And the sort of jargon or spin from them is that will be very good for the country long term. I'm not convinced that that's good for the fiscus, because someone has to repay the the bonds that were issued, at 11 or 12% a little while ago, and so real returns on government bonds are going to be super high. And so maybe let's park the forecasting, because none of us can predict what inflation is going to do next week. Forget about in 3 or 4 years' time. I always think when you make a property decision, you use the words, and I think people do it, is jumping in. And you can bungee jump, that's fine, but property decision should be monumentally slow, like even slower than a tortoise. You do this very carefully. And I think if you were on the fence, let's say 6 months or a year ago, where you were trying to decide, was it time to buy because it was right for you, for your family, your position, your decision making, then using the interest rate drops as a little bit of a buffer to kind of tip you over the edge. If you were kind of 50-50 in terms of making the decision, then that's okay. But if a 0.5% difference in interest rates makes a property affordable for you, and that's the only reason why the property becomes affordable, I'm going to argue the property is not affordable. You shouldn't be doing it. So yes, you definitely need a buffer. I think it's always shocking when you buy a house how much goes wrong, or whether it's an apartment or a house, how much goes wrong with the property when you buy it. You move in and all of a sudden the geyser breaks, and all of a sudden there's a damp problem, an issue, whatever it is. And so you definitely need cash just to cover things that you can't foresee today. So the buffer is good, but equally, preparing, like Rhys said, if interest rates go up 40% and you were paying 20 grand a month, and suddenly now you've got to pay 26 or 28 grand a month in just in mortgage costs, that if that's going to put you out of your house, it's a big call. Like, you just don't do it. You do it when you can expect and tolerate almost a 50 or 60% increase in your mortgage repayments. I'm not saying you want to do that, but at least have the capability to deal with that for a few years.
And then, Rhys, I've seen your name in my inbox for a number of years, so I know you've been in the game for a long time. What are you seeing in terms of the popularity of property purchases, in the sense that people are striving to attain that as the be all end all? I need to own a property.
Yeah, it's still, I think just generally, it still seems in the South African market to be aspirational to own property. I think there's some historical cultural issues which would also drive that, where many families have never owned property before, and it's a real aspirational thing to do that, or to be the first generation to do that in the family. So I think that remains a big driver just of property purchase, outside of the financial considerations. And we definitely still see that. Yeah, there's a lot of aspirant first-time home buyers that are trying to get into that property market. Still, of people buying properties with home loans, still it's pretty much at 50% of those buyers are first-time buyers. So it's still a very significant part of the market. And unfortunately, as Warren has indicated, they don't have a 50-60% buffer. We're seeing the vast majority of those buyers being very, very close in terms of their affordability relative to their total available affordability. So that the sort of aspirational requirement of getting a property seems to be, in some cases, more important than some of the financial considerations.
Okay, and then in terms of the affordability, are you seeing, and I'm sure, Warren, you may also be getting clients asking you about this, where people are going into property purchases as joint purchases, for example, couples that are not married yet, but they want a joint bond, or even friends or family clubbing together to make it affordable?
Yeah, so definitely seeing more of that, where we're seeing 2, 3, 4 people getting together to buy property. Probably upwards of 10 or 15% of the application volumes we're seeing are multiple buyers, so that's outside of just husband and wife or spouse. But I think in terms of other formats of affordability, we also have seen many people opting for longer terms to their loans, so pushing up their loan terms to 30 years. And we see that more in high interest rate environments, obviously, to try and get over that affordability requirement. Probably about 30% of our applications are for 30-year term loans, with the balance being in the 20s. So it's a big chunk of customers taking those much longer term loans. And also we've definitely seen, more and more people really working hard to try and put down deposits. And our percentage of deposit does seem to have increased, which is great, to try and drop the affordability, or try and drop the monthly repayment and reach the affordability levels.
Neesa, if I could just jump in and ask a question. Rhys, how are the banks looking at let's say, 20-year versus a 30-year? I mean, obviously they get a customer for an extra 50% if they take someone on for 30 years. But I guess it also neutralizes a portion of their balance sheets for lending into the future. So is it something where do they nudge clients that way with better interest rates, or is it no different?
No, they actually do the opposite. The interest rate actually worsens over 30 years, so they actually try and nudge them more towards the 20. And I mean, certainly from our business perspective, it's not our advice to take a 30-year loan, but clearly what we do see is a lot of people taking the 30-year loan to get over that initial affordability gap, and then with an access bond start putting more than their monthly repayment in. So the actual repayment term may still be well below 20, but they've at least got their sort of they've managed to acquire the property, and we see that fairly often.
And I'm taking over your call, Neesa, but the interesting, about 5 or 6 years ago, it felt to me anecdotally that banks weren't really giving prime minus on terms on mortgages, and now it feels to me as if they're kind of opening the checkbooks a little bit, that you can get prime minus. And I've had 1 or 2 people sort of humble bragging that they're even getting close to prime minus 1.5 again, and prime minus 2 I think is the best I've heard. I'm not sure I can believe that was someone after a few beers, but is that in the market? Is that a kind of, not for everybody, I guess?
It is, Warren. It's definitely become extremely competitive. Banks are very aggressive, sort of on trying to gain market shares at the moment, and pricing as a result has come down quite significantly. So our average rate that we get, let's just say last month across all our business, was prime less 0.7. And that's probably, if we look a year ago, similar time, it was probably prime less 0.3 or 4. So it's moved sort of 40 odd basis points in a year. And we're definitely seeing at the bottom end, there's I've seen a prime less 2.5. So those sort of numbers are kind of back again at the top levels.
What do I have to do to get prime minus 2.5? Do I have to seed my dog? How do I convince the bank to give me a rate like that?
Yeah, you need a very significant deposit and be buying in the right places.
Okay.
So in terms of the alternatives to property ownership, rental comes in, and then there's the question of, should I rent or should I buy? And then we've got one of our readers, one of our viewers, Chris McKenzie, says that the rentals in Cape Town, probably the most expensive in the country, I want to say. He says his rent went from 22,000 to 28,000, and the agent was kind of, well, got to take it or leave it. And Ivan says it's the same in Knysna. So Warren, how do you advise clients where they're spending that portion of their income, which is a sizable chunk, on rent? And the thinking is, well, why am I paying it towards somebody else's bond?
It's the thing we get told by our parents and our grandparents and aunties, uncles, everybody is, and when you start work, don't pay off a landlord's mortgage by renting from the landlord, just buy your own. And maybe just to start there, I think if you had to take that whole property buying decision and you compare it to buying exchange traded fund or a unit trust. You look at the transaction costs of getting into property and getting out of property. They're incredibly high relative to generic investment, a generic unit trust, and a generic exchange traded fund. And so when someone just says just buy a property and don't pay the rent, you have to be holistic in your view of what does it actually cost you to rent, and what does it cost you to be a homeowner? And understanding that you're paying a lot of costs on the way in. You're paying legal fees. At some point, you're going to pay an agent to get out of the property. Even if you're in a sectional title, like an apartment, even if it's a quarter bedroom, with half a toilet, you're still going to pay, levies, and you're still going to be in for a, body corporate when they decide it's time to repaint, and maybe they've been lax. They're going to ask you for a special levy. All of those things. So owning is an expensive business, and I think, as a principle, if you just say, well, it always makes sense to buy, I think you're going to get yourself into deep trouble very quickly. If it's a lifetime of pain if you do that. I think you buy a property when your time horizon is around a decade. When you say, I'm happy to stay in this place for at least, a decade's a good number, but maybe 8 to 10 years or longer, then all of those costs of buying in at the start and selling one day at the end, and all of the maintenance, all of that becomes much more tolerable because you're dividing it by 10 years. But if you do the opposite, which is what everyone tells us to do when we start work, is, buy your first little studio place and then sell it after 3 years, and buy the one bedroom and then sell it after 3 years, and buy, all you're doing is you're making the estate agents rich. The lawyers love you because they're getting bond registration costs, and the government loves you if you're paying transfer duties, all of that stuff. So the fees are then really prejudicial to you. And so I would say, in a situation like that, if your rent has gone from 20 to 28,000 over a couple of years, go and have a look at what the property cost would be to buy in, and add in that the city of Cape Town is, loving the rising property prices because they really want to charge you rates that are way through the roof compared to other places now. And then all the silent killers of property ownership. If you look at what it costs you to pay for refuse collection or sewerage and all those things, they're small amounts at the start. 10 years ago, it was a small amount. Now, all of a sudden, it's quite a sizable amount. It's going up, in some instances, 2, 3, 4 times the rate of inflation. So municipalities are looking at homeowners and saying, there are ways we can make money out of them on a large scale, charging lots of people small amounts and then increasing those small amounts every year by a lot. And so I think be very careful if you're going to do that. I don't mind being a homeowner, for long term. When your kids start school and you say, well, we found a school for our kids and this is where they're going to be for the next 12 years. Great, buy the place, do your homework. But you're changing properties every 3 years and you want to be mobile and you want to go and work from anywhere and be a tech worker, whatever. Don't buy a property. It's probably going to be a disaster.
And then, Rhys, I'm not sure if you would be able to comment on this. Interestingly enough, we've done a poll in the group. Thank you to ABSA for sponsoring this webinar and making it possible. And the poll says that up to 40% of viewers feel they're not confident when it comes to the understanding of the financial pros and cons of home ownership. So hopefully you will have more questions answered after this webinar. Mel wants to know, how do you structure a deal where you're assisting an adult child to buy a property and avoid donation tax? I'm not sure I think this might be more Warren's wheelhouse, but Rhys, I'll give you a go.
Yeah, structuring a purchase of a property for a child, we would certainly do a fair amount of that around the individuals, the parent generally standing surety for the loan, which doesn't, Warren, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but that doesn't require any sort of donations tax as such. So effectively, the loan is taken out in the child's name, assuming that the child's over the age of 18, and the parent would simply then stand surety for that loan, which allows the property then to be acquired in that individual's name and the home loan in the child's name. So that we do fairly regularly, and that works quite effectively.
Yeah, I think it's a very nice. It's a very nice structure to do that. Obviously, I'm the guy that usually looks after the parents, and I'm always saying to them, please don't sign sureties for anything when you're older, because you don't have much time to recover if your kid, drops the ball on the property and all of a sudden you've got a burden. So one of the other ways is, you can also do a loan from a parent to a child. So if you've got the capital available as a parent and you want to help your adult children, there's nothing wrong with creating a loan. And you can make it you can and should make it a proper legal agreement where you lend the money to your child, you have to charge them kind of at least a market-related interest, and it doesn't have to be at prime plus, so you don't have to really profit from your kids. That's probably not the right thing to do. But you can give them a fairly friendly loan as long as it's not sort of 1% a year. But doing that and then allowing them to use that capital from you as a huge deposit, and then negotiating, for a mortgage for maybe half the value of the property directly with the banks is one way. At least from the parent's point of view, if something goes horribly wrong and the child's financial position is severely compromised, the exposure from the parent's point of view is the capital that they've loaned, and there isn't an additional amount that they'll pay. I have seen situations where the parents will go in on a 50-50 ownership deal with their children. It becomes quite messy when let's say the parent dies and then all of a sudden there's a whole estate duty issue around that. So I don't love that structure, but I think the parent standing surety or the loan from the parent to the child is probably a nice and fairly neat structure. But just make sure that you cover these things with proper legal agreements. You don't want SARS coming back to you to say, the interest that you didn't charge was a donation or something. Just, as always, do your homework.
And then Pranation says he recently was looking at the property market and he was horrified at the amount of transfer duty that was required. And he wants to know, Rhys, if blockchain will it take away that dynamic in South Africa, and how long would that take?
Yeah, there's definitely a desire for that to happen. It's in the deeds office where where that whole deeds registry is put onto the blockchain. But and there's been some movement in terms of getting us there, but we are a long way off. I don't think we're going to see that necessarily in my lifetime. But yeah, there's certainly an intent and there's work started to get us there. But it's a significant exercise to achieve that still.
And then, so before we jump into, I've got another question coming from Ingrid. But before we go there, Warren, I feel like, so Ingrid's asking a question about property purchases as a retired person. And I want to say, if South Africa's retirement savings percentage or proportion of only 6% is the number that gets tossed around, only 6% of South Africans are ready to retire financially secure. But people are getting into the property market. My suspicion and my feeling is then that people are prioritizing buying a property over actually saving for retirement. And what are your thoughts on that as a financial planner? Is it something you see a lot? Is the thinking that, okay, when I'm retiring, I'll sell it and I'll realize this vast amount of money?
It's very much sort of an income related story. So you'll find, I suspect, again, it's anecdotal, but at very low income families where let's say a lot of the money being generated by the family is for really kind of real labor work, blue collar labor or even domestic workers, they'll do everything they can to buy the house where they will want to live and want to retire one day. And so a lot of those purchases might not be, where we see kind of big mortgages and big home loans, etc. It might be done kind of, piecemeal. And so those are, that's the financial security that those families will have at their retirement. And then they might have to rely on state subsidies for a portion, to get social grants, etc., to get food, but at least they have the home. And sort of the understanding that they might be able to use some of the land that they own to grow some food, etc., etc. So you'll find that that very low income level, the home is the castle, and it's the thing that gives security more than anything else. At the other end of the spectrum, some people have no trust in stock markets and unit trusts and exchange traded funds, etc. And so, being able to drive past the building they own and go and touch those bricks and, put their hand on the wall and they feel that provides security in the sense that no one can steal the house Well, I have seen houses being stolen in Joburg, brick by brick, but it's rare. So they trust what they can see and what they can touch, and so they might then use property as either an income generating asset or at retirement. So they would say, I've got 5 or 10 apartments or 3 or 4 houses, and I'm going to live on the rent from those, and I'll manage the tenants. So they'll use that as an income generator and stay out of the system. They don't understand the stock market. They can't understand why Donald Trump pushes share prices up or down in South Africa, and it's all like they'll think it's the Illuminati or something. So they don't care. And then also a lot of entrepreneurial people will run their own business and buy property because it's things that they can control. They can influence it. They can't influence the stock markets or the unit trust market, so they go to where they can put effort in. So I think it's very hard when you look at the property market to paint it with one picture, paint it with one brush. I think we're so segmented from an economic point of view and then from an education point of view that it's always going to be nuanced, Neesa. I think for me, I think going into retirement and having a property that you live in, it makes a lot of sense to me. I think if you've got the capital where you can live off your investments and have a paid off house, ideal. Like that for me is the ideal scenario. I worry if someone is going to live in a house and they don't have enough money from their investments to feed themselves. Then maybe you need to review whether it's the right decision to actually be a homeowner when you can sell that and live off the capital and just pay rent, which needs to be affordable, of course.
So many points firing off in my head on the back of that. I think one of my key takeaways from that answer is, as with most things personal finance, the choices are very individual and very much tailored to each person's financial circumstances, which can differ widely. But you mentioned investing in property for income, and that leads us very nicely back into Ingrid's question. She says, would you recommend a retired person scaling down, sell their family home, buy a smaller property, and then rent and invest the residual income?
Okay, so sell the family home. Let's say your family home is, I've got to make the math simple so I can understand it. You sell your family home for 10 million rand. And then you go and buy, let's say, I don't know, a timeshare, not a timeshare, a sectional title place for 5 million. Now you've got 5 million that you can invest and live off the income from that. I love that idea. From the point of view that the family home ends up being quite an expensive thing to maintain. If you've got 4 bedrooms, that generally means a garden, which means you might need to pay for the property to be looked after. You might not be able to do all of that work yourself. Generally bigger properties will be more expensive to insure, all of those things. So scaling down and making life a little bit simpler, firstly to maintain and to keep clean and all of that stuff. Your actual labor costs of running the properties reduce, all the rates, etc. All of that comes down. Insurance, everything gets cheaper. And also when let's say if you imagine life, at 65, it's quite different to when you're 78. When you're 78, do you really want to be climbing on the roof and checking the gutters or mowing the lawn and all that stuff? So you want life to be simple and easy. So I often will tell people to do that. To once the kids are flown the nest, why do you need this big house? You don't use all the bedrooms. Some people don't even go into some of the rooms that they've got in their houses because they were the kids' rooms and now they're not necessary. So yes, by all means, I think it's a great call.
Rhys, Elvine wants to know what type of property and area in South Africa is best to invest in right now for good rental income and future growth. I don't know if you have the crystal ball on that, but maybe you can tell us what the trends are currently.
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question. So I mean, certainly, if we look, let's just look at the city of Cape Town versus, say, Johannesburg or Durban. So Cape Town has seen significantly increased demand, and as a result, prices have pushed up fairly significantly over the past 5 to 10 years, driven a lot by COVID, semigration into the Cape, municipal performance issues in certain other parts of the country relative to, say, Cape Town. And also there's definitely shortage of space to keep building in the Cape. So there's stock shortages. So that's driven up property prices, and through that driven up rentals as well. So I think a lot of it's around timing. So, I think the question is, if you were to buy a property now in Sea Point in the Western Cape, as an example, in Cape Town, you would be paying, a chunky amount for it. You'd be earning a strong rental income, and you'd be able to demand a very strong rental escalation. I mean, we've seen escalations in Sea Point of 10% plus every year. So that's kind of your one option. And I think, it links, and Warren's mentioned this before, it links back to duration. So how long you're going to own that investment for, and what sort of capital appreciation you're going to get having bought it at potentially a relatively high level to other parts of the country. I mean, the alternative is you buy something in Sandton. I think potentially your price point is significantly lower because prices have been subdued there for a long time. So potentially your capital appreciation there might well be stronger over time. Your rental income would be lower relative to that which you've bought in Cape Town, but obviously price to rental probably be fairly similar. And it's a difficult answer as to which is going to be better. But I do think that it's going to require a lot of sort of investigation. But potentially a Johannesburg investment in a flat in Sandton may well, over the longer term, give you a better return, both capital and rental, than perhaps a higher price place in Sea Point right now.
I'm going to jump in, Neesa, because I think it's as the property ignoramus myself. The one thing I would say is psychology counts a lot, and when everybody's jumped on a bandwagon on buying an investment, it doesn't matter what the investment is, and that investment has done incredibly well for quite some time. It tends to attract people to buy even more of it because they think it's just going to go up forever, and that psychology is real with markets, whether it's a property market or a stock market. And so the people with the intestinal fortitude, the courage to go into the place where everyone else is scared, they if they do their homework correctly, they can actually make good money. And just intuitively, I feel having been part of that semigration from Joburg back to the Cape. I think you look at some of the value that you can get in Joburg, on a per square meter basis. There is real value in Joburg, and yes, the municipality is a mess, and it's probably going to be a mess for quite some time. But it's interesting to see what sort of districts are doing within Joburg, how they're trying to take control and improve their lot, and so. Don't be afraid sometimes of swimming against the tide a little bit. If everyone's swimming out, maybe there's great opportunity to go in. And Joburg's the economic heartland. It doesn't fail very quickly. It fails over a long period of time if it fails. So if you think that the country's got good prospects, that means eventually Joburg will.
Yeah, absolutely. And a slightly different take on it. I bumped into somebody a few months ago who was telling me he was lucky enough about 8 years ago to jump into the sorry, I must stop saying jump into the property. He bought in the property market. He got a 2-bedroom flat in Sandton. And about 2 years ago, he decided, what am I doing? So he packed up everything, moved back to his family home, and is now renting out his flat at a phenomenal rate as an Airbnb. Says it's fully booked all the time, can't get space. People are just willing to pay.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the investment demand in certain parts of the Cape, sort of Atlantic Seaboard, those areas, are very much driven by that Airbnb market because you just can't get a return on those properties with a longer term rental. But I think there's also regulatory concerns as to where that goes. I know the City of Cape Town's looking at potentially taxing Airbnb properties differently to normal residential properties. So one has that as a caution. But I think to Warren's point earlier, if we look at our home loan numbers, people are still very much focused on investment buying in the Cape. So 31% of our home loan applications last month, and it's been a similar case for the last 12 months, in the Western Cape. So 31% of our home loan applications in the Western Cape are investment buyers. In Johannesburg or in Gauteng, it's about 5 or 6%. So the money's going to the Western Cape from an investment buying perspective. It hasn't switched as yet. It's been that way for probably the last couple of years, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next couple of years as pricing in Cape Town just becomes perhaps just too expensive.
What do you mean becomes? I think it's already there.
I mean, relative to the rental return you can get.
Warren, I've got two questions. I'm going to tie them together because I think they are related. Michael wants to know, would you recommend buying in your name versus buying via an inter vivos trust to ensure continuity and avoid paying death taxes and estate duties? And then Warren wants to know, at what stage would you consider placing your home in a trust for the children's sake?
Yeah, so the thing about putting your primary home, your residential property into a trust or a company, it doesn't matter of the structure, just understanding that consequence. We don't get many breaks from SARS. SARS will always take their cut of our income or our capital. But one of the breaks is that if you live in a house and it is yours and you don't rent it out, and you sell it one day, a portion of the capital growth that you get from selling that property is tax-free. You do get a benefit there. The moment you put it into a structure, you put it into a trust, or you put it into a company, that benefit is much harder. In fact, I'd say most of the time it's almost impossible to get a benefit like that. And putting a property into a trust, SARS and Treasury and everybody are going after trusts in every way they possibly can. So it's easily the most expensive vehicle from a tax point of view. So capital gains tax is really high on trusts, and there's no sort of incremental tax. You pay a really high rate of capital gains tax right from the beginning. The same on if you were renting it out. So the decision to put a property into a trust should be done with even more consideration than you would just buying normally. And the thing that the property I would consider putting into a trust would be something which you think is a generational asset. In other words, if you think we've got sort of the prime, I always think about that maths and science teacher that taught the nation maths and science, William Smith, when he had that place in Knysna, like on the Knysna Heads. That's a generational property where it did go from one generation to the next. It's extremely rare. But you take the family apartment, where three of you live in in one of these mass developments, and you think that that's a generational property. It's not true. There's nothing rare or special about it except sentiment, and understanding that you put a property into a trust for the kids. Just consider where the kids will be one day. Will they grow up in the town? Will they grow up in that city? In fact, will they stay in that country? And so if your kids end up in everywhere from, in the old days it might have been the US as well, but now post-Trump world it might be anywhere from the UK to Australia. And so what will they do with a property in South Africa if they don't live here? So I would say, generational transfer of properties, putting those into a trust makes a lot of sense to me, but those are not as commonplace as you think. I would be having that conversation if your kids are a little bit older. It would be a conversation with them as well before you make a call like that. Especially if you've got adult children, to ask them. Let's say you've got a holiday home. Great. They love going there as young children, and they love going there even if they've got their own kids, when mom and dad are paying for the maintenance. What happens when it's time for them to look after the property, and do they still think it's such an amazing place, or is it just amazing because it's free? And so just understanding those kinds of conversations, but I think you should be incredibly careful of just putting a property into a trust.
Interesting. And then Praneshan's got another question, Rhys. Are banks offering more flexi-bond facilities where you can fully draw down each month? Is that even a thing that's still available with the National Credit Act?
No. So I think to get sort of maximum interest deductibility on your investment property, I think there's certainly availability of 100% loans for investment properties still. So you could not have to put down a deposit. And obviously the full interest repayment on the home loan would be deductible against the rental income that you're receiving. But I think that's as much opportunity as you have. You still need to show affordability for the property, in terms of, qualifying for the loan, if that answers the question.
Okay. I think the question was the access bond facility. Is that still something that is available?
Yes, absolutely. So access bonds are definitely still available, and you can obviously put funds into the so if you get a bonus or that type of thing, you can put funds into the facility and withdraw them at later stages. Those are very commonplace across most home loans now.
Warren, what's your thinking on using the home loan as a savings
I
vehicle?
love it. It's probably the best. Paying a lot more money, a lot of extra money into your access bond is probably the best emergency fund there is, because let's just say again, to keep the math simple, that your interest rate that you have to pay is 10% a year. I look at storing extra money in your bond as getting a guaranteed tax-free return on your money. You're saving yourself 10% every year that you have money stored in a bond like that. So provided you're disciplined, that it really is actually your emergency money, or the plan is to get it paid down faster. I mean, there are no investments in the world that are guaranteed to give you a tax-free growth rate of 10% a year anywhere. You might be very lucky and get growth rates of 10 to 12% from the stock market over a decade, but that's not a guarantee. It's a possibility, and certainly not tax-free. There'll always be some capital gains. So I love I love it when people kind of extra pay into their access bonds, as long as they're disciplined.
Absolutely. And then Lynn's got a question that I think both of you can give some insight on. She says she bought a home in Kommetjie and it was expensive, and she used all her savings for the deposits. And subsequently, she's lost her job. She's now struggling with the mortgage, and the rates are very high. Should she sell? So I think, Rhys, if you can answer that in terms of a property demand in the Kommetjie area, what does that look like, and what are the financial pros and cons of that choice?
Yeah, certainly property demand and prices in sort of that area of Cape Town is still very, very strong. Noordhoek, Kommetjie, et cetera, is still very strong demand, and probably shortage of stock. So I think timing-wise, in terms of selling, probably potentially not a bad time. Financially, whether it's the right decision, I'll let Warren comment more on that. But I mean, if there is a significant deposit in the property, potentially, one could take further lending on that property, but that from an affordability perspective, given job circumstances, may not work. So yeah, I'll let Warren comment more on the financial implications.
It's so we've got to talk about principles, Neesa, because obviously we don't know the ins and outs of the position. But my first principle is, when you're in a hole, a debt hole, the first thing you've got to do is stop digging. And so in a situation like this, if you don't have a job and you've got a mortgage and you owe the council, you get a little bit of leeway for a little bit of time before the problems really start to kind of compound against you. And the extreme version of this is that the bank takes your house back, they mortgage it, they auction it or sell it. And I promise you, they're not interested in the very best price that they can get for the house. They're interested in how do they recoup the exposure they've got, the debt that they've got. If they get an extra amount after that, that's a bonus to you. So you don't want a banker to drive your financial position. So number one, if you don't think your prospects of getting a job very quickly are real, and that you're not going to be able to pick up the costs shortly, then you sell as fast as you possibly can and get in front of this whole thing, and get out of the debt problem, because you're in a hole now. And this is one of those situations where you make a very hard decision now, that potentially saves you decades of heartache later. But gee, you don't want to dawdle on this one. You want to be very quick. If you've paid a big deposit, that might mean that you can sell the house and have some capital left over, and then you make different decisions. But I think looking in the mirror and saying, this is my reality. Forget about hope now. About I hope that things get better, and I hope the property prices double in the next year. They're not going to double in the next year. There isn't going to be a friendly banker that just gives you a loan for the interest that you owe for the next year. They have jobs, they have shareholders and bosses, etc. So I think if you don't have the ability very quickly to repay, sell the house as fast as you possibly can.
And then Sunmi Lulua wants to know, when it comes to buy to rent, is it more lucrative to go for commercial property rather than residential property, Rhys?
I'm not expert at commercial property, but I think the decision is probably similar. One would have to understand the price that you the future capital appreciation that you'll get on the property, and the rental yields that you can expect on the property over time, and escalations you're going to achieve, and also relative to potential risks around vacancies, etc. So I think it would have to be that exercise that one would need to do across the two properties to understand which is potentially the better opportunity. I don't think it's a rule of thumb that says commercial is better than residential. Obviously, depends on the price point you pay and what your return will be over time.
And that particular property as compared, yeah.
100%.
And then D wants to know, when the bond is nearly paid off, only 5,000 Rand remaining on the bond, is it worth keeping it open for emergency fund access?
Yeah, if you have an access facility, absolutely worthwhile keeping it open. It's an immediate source of funds that you can access very, very quickly. And yeah, it's a great tool to have, and a great ability to access money very quickly for emergencies. So I would definitely recommend keeping it open. You can retain the balance low, and use whatever excess facilities there.
I think the
Warren?
interesting thing about life is when you desperately need to borrow money from the bank, that's when they won't lend you any money. And so when you're in a situation where you've got a home loan that's pretty much paid up, keeping it available for the rainy day you hope never happens is a great idea, because that emergency could happen overnight. And I mean, COVID taught us all that. There could be the complete unforeseen thing that really just derails you for a period of time. And having an accessible amount of money in a mortgage makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's keeping it available as long as possible, as long as the interest rates are and the fees and all those things are fine. It is, as I said earlier, it's the best emergency fund there is. So I mean, even to the point sometimes where you say, well, I mean, we should all be buying our cars cash, but if you do need to finance a car and you've got a pretty much paid up mortgage, it's probably a bit of a cheaper interest rate than anything else. So using that to buy a car and then paying off the car over 3 years, please, not longer, makes sense.
Not 20 years.
No, please don't do that over the next 30 years.
Yeah, as Warren says, it's relatively cheap money compared to any other option. Certainly a personal sort of unsecured loan, if that's where you have to end up going. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then just a reminder to our viewers that Daily Maverick's flagship event of the year is coming up soon on the 28th of August. The gathering, it's going to be in Cape Town. It's called the Changemakers Impact Edition. We're going to have lots of exciting speakers and a great lineup. I'll be there if you want to interact and ask any questions and have chats. I tried to entice Warren, but unfortunately he's traveling at that time. And then Nkazimulu wants to know, his parents in Durban, her parents, I'm not sure, are paying her rent over the last few years in Cape Town. The parents now have cash and they're considering buying an apartment. Is that wise? I'm not sure if that apartment they want to buy is in Cape Town for her to live in, or an apartment for them. Warren?
Oh, tough
on that
one.
limited information.
Glad you said Warren.
I was looking up into the sky hoping you were going to say Rhys. I mean, I think the thing there again, so a couple of things. One, here's a capital amount that parents have, and now if you've got an adult child, are you donating that, or are you lending it to the child, and that whole situation. So I think just be careful about tax, and I mean, if it's an asset that they want to keep, so they're happy to help you while you're living in Cape Town and you're kind of getting, building steam in your own career, and you're getting a bit of financial breathing room, that's fine. But if they want you to kind of be the owner one day, then the things that we discussed a bit earlier about them, helping you buy the place with capital might make more sense. The one thing I like about this from their perspective is they at least know their tenant, and so they could do their due diligence. And if they, if after this you play them the video and they go, no, we're not going to have you as our tenant on our property, then you know the answer. But if they're happy and they know that you'll be there for a couple of years and it's something they can rent out after, I mean, it might be worth considering. But I mean, Rhys has pointed out, gee, it's the Cape Town property market's done incredibly well for quite some time. So I think if you do it for other considerations, which is giving the adult child a bit of a leg up and a bit of help and a start, fine. But if you're expecting to get phenomenal property returns on a property market that's done incredibly well, that might be a tough sell.
Absolutely. Then John Grayling, we're actually almost out of time. We've got 10 minutes to go, unbelievably. I think I'm definitely going to have both of you back again. Thanks again to ABSA for sponsoring. And then our last question, let's take John Grayling. He says him and his wife are 75. Their house is paid off. They've just had an investment which has matured. They've got about 5 million Rand that's come out of that investment. And now they're wondering, should they invest again or buy another house and invest and about another property to let, bearing in mind that they are 75.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have a crack first, but Warren's probably good advice coming from you. But I do think that potentially at that age and relative to the duration of the investment and the likely return you'll get, given the costs of getting in and getting out, and just the risk factors around potential property ownership at that age relative to other investments. My sense is probably there are alternatives that may be better. And then I'm sure Warren has all those alternatives.
It was such beautiful diplomacy the way Rhys put that. So I'm thank you for answering, Rhys. John, I mean, when you've got when you're making a residential property decision, let's assume it's a decade at least. And you're 75, the actuaries say, kind of average in South Africa, we live to somewhere around age, I don't know, it's 85 to 90, let's just say. And so it's going to be tough for you to realize over your lifetime the full potential of a decision like that, adding in all the transaction costs, etc. So I'm sorry to be a little bit more blunt, but I think kind of just buying a very generic balanced unit trust or kind of exchange traded funds that are super diversified. Your transaction costs are much lower. Your probability of return, you're looking at a 5-year time horizon or longer, not a 10-year time horizon or longer. So I'm not sure I would buy another property unless it's there's a broader family consideration where everyone else is involved and there's something else happening. But if it's just two of you and it's for your income for your retirement, I think you can do better things with that money for a 10 or 15-year period where you might want income as well.
Yes. So I think with 5 minutes to go, we've definitely got a lot of questions that have come through, some of which we haven't even been able to touch. I want to encourage the viewers, if you want to email me, neesa@dailymaverick.co.za, please do, and we can line up more webinars on the topic of home ownership. There's lots of different avenues to dig into, and I'm pretty sure Rhys and Warren are going to come back. I've been very nice to them both. And then, gentlemen, would you like to just offer your final roundup concluding thoughts? My sense is that property is a very emotional, individual decision.
Yeah, so I mean, I would definitely agree, and I mean, personally, I think there is a place for property investment in a portfolio, and I think there's, you know, as with everything, you know, one requires diversification. So it is a part of an investment portfolio, and I think there's definitely pros and cons in investing in property relative to other asset classes. Um, but I mean, I think, you know, the as a percentage of a portfolio, I still think it's something that one should consider. It provides, you know, potentially inflation hedged returns. If you hold it for, you know, a decent period of time and you buy in the right location, you know, you should get fairly decent capital appreciation. And as Warren said earlier, the transactional costs, if you do hold it for 10 to 15 years, become, you know, much smaller percentage of your return. But making sure that you manage it properly, that you maintain it well, insure it well, are all obviously key considerations. But do the homework, understand exactly what you're getting into, make sure that you have sufficient affordability to afford the property, and assess it relative to your other investment opportunities.
I wish I could disagree, so I'll just add in 2 cents there, and maybe the one is, you know, the home you're going to live in. I think it does make sense to, if you're going to stay in it for a decade or longer, it makes sense to buy. Do all the homework. All of those considerations are important. If you're fixated on buy to let as an investment, so you want to be a property owner and rent to lots of tenants, etc. I think I understand that you're actually going into a business. You know, it's not you're not investing in property. You're in business, and the business happens to be the business of property, which means you're dealing with tenants, etc., etc. And you know, you've got to manage that business as you would if you bought a restaurant, as you would if you bought any other business. It's not just fire and forget. You can't, you know, outsource all the responsibility to a bunch of estate agents and hope that they're going to look after your interests. You would be incredibly lucky if that works out in your favor. So you have to be clear in your mind that you're entering a business. It might be a side hustle, but it's going to take time and effort, and you're going to have heartache when tenants don't pay, etc., etc. And so yes, you can, but I always think, you know, you started, Neesa, with the rich dad, poor dad, and why does he make money from selling videos and books and talks and not from investing in property? Why does he not keep quiet? I always wonder that you know, that story. I think he's a media guy who happens to talk a lot about property, but he's a media guy.
As a media person, I'm not going to touch that one. Thank you so much again. On the buy to let, I think we can actually do a whole separate webinar on that. My only word of caution there is that in the South African system, the law is very much in favor of the tenants. So once you've got a tenant in, it's very difficult to get them out again if they don't want to leave. And that's something I would caution against. Thank you both for joining us and for being such great sports and just handling all the questions that have been thrown your direction. Thank you very much to the viewers for your audience participation. It's been fantastic. And finally, thank you to ABSA for sponsoring this webinar and making it possible. Hopefully, we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you, Neesa. Bye-bye.